Hello, philosophy students. Today we are going to discuss the first argument against materialism. We've already established that something must be eternal from our previous chapters, so that raises a question of what is eternal? Is matter eternal? Is matter all that exists? Is something clear, and is that matter? Before we get into the nitty gritty parts of this argument, we need to establish what makes something eternal. In order for something to be eternal, it must be independent, self existing, self maintaining, and self explaining. The very definition of eternal means that it has always and will always exist, and any straying away from these four traits would mean that it lacks an eternal trait. If the eternal is not self existing, if it somehow had a beginning, it would mean that it has not always existed. Similarly, if the universe is dependent in any way, shape, or form, it would mean that it will not be able to continue to exist. Okay, so let's begin analyzing the argument against materialism. We've already established that something must be eternal, and we've already established the properties inherent in that which is eternal. The question then becomes, what is eternal? And by the very first slide of the presentation, you would already know that it isn't matter. So why is that? Why is matter something so innate to existence itself, not eternal? Well, let's find out. Suppose the material world is eternal, what then? As we've already established, that which is eternal must possess the following traits. It must be independent, self existing, self explaining, and most importantly, self maintaining. And it's this final trait which we will build our argument around. Okay, going back to our example, if the material world is eternal, it must possess all three traits. In other words, it must be self maintaining. The material world is not self maintaining, therefore, it is not eternal. We've established that the major premise is true. The only possible objection then is to the minor premise. So why then is the minor premise true? The only poss oh, Why then is the material world not self-maintaining? Such an answer is directed to three parts of the universe. The universe, after all, is incredibly large, and tackling such an answer involves tackling all aspects of the universe: the universe in general, the universe in its major components, and the universe as a whole. Now, I am not as qualified in discussing such matters, so bunlong will take over from here.
Thank you for having me on the show. Now we begin to explore the idea that the universe is not self-maintaining. First, let's look at the universe as a whole. The universe is highly differentiated. We have different states of matter, such as hot and cold, liquid and solid, dense and light, and etc. But these things will eventually reach a state of sameness called entropy. Why and how does this prove that the universe in general is not self-maintaining? Well, let's begin with the second law of thermodynamics, which states if left alone in an isolated environment, matter will eventually reach an entropy of energy. A steaming hot cup of coffee will eventually become room temperature if left on the coffee table. Its temperature balances out with the room. It's disgusting, by the way. This applies to all matter, where eventually a state of equilibrium of energy will be reached between all matter. Therefore, the universe is not self-maintaining. It cannot keep itself from dying from a heat death, where all energy bounces out and motion ceases. Now let's look more closely at the major parts of the universe. One of the most observable celestial object in our sky is our sun, worshipped in many religions as a god, Amun-Ra, Amaterasu, and Apollo. But the idea of something that eventually perishes, being a god, is irrational. We want our gods to last forever. We know from scientific calculations the sun will burn out in 5 billion years or so. It cannot maintain itself because it cannot produce its own hydrogen, which is required for the sun to produce energy. The sun is finite in size, that is self-evident, and eventually run out of hydrogen to burn. What that means for our Earth, it's not a pretty picture. As for the universe as a whole, there is no evidence it can be self-maintaining. One of the theories supporting this is supported by the physics community is the idea of the oscillating universe, a series of big bangs, then collapses. However, for that theory to be valid, we would need 10 times the mass we currently have in our universe, so that it can produce enough gravity to cause the universe to contract. Furthermore, once the force of the Big Bang expansion and the force of contraction reach equilibrium, those forces would have to cancel each other out, making the oscillating universe stopped. It just stops right there. That renders the theory invalid. There are more theories that try to support the universe's self-maintenance, such as the vacuum theory and Stephen Hawking's black hole theory, but they all fail to prove their assumptions. The vacuum theory states energy existed in a false vacuum, and the universe was created when matter was born out of that energy. This is the same as saying being from non-being. It's meaningless. Hawking believed black holes caused the contraction of the universe and would eventually collapse into zero size. Having zero size is impossible. That's the same as saying non-existence or non-being. Such, we reach the conclusion all matter is not eternal after refuting these many arguments in favor of it. As to what's eternal, catch us next time when we break down the idea of some is eternal. Thank you for tuning in and have a good day.
Thank you for tuning in and have a wonderful day.
Have
How
a great
long is
rest of
that?
the night.